Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. This is Janice Thompson from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Thank you all for joining us for day 3 of the Tribal Veterans Healing to Wellness Court virtual training. Today's session is Mitigating Trauma in Courthouses, Understanding the Science of the Brain and Trauma Responses, Historical Trauma and Substance Use Disorders. Before we get started, here are a few housekeeping notes for today's session. Your control panel will appear on your user screen. All attendees will be muted during this presentation. When to call into the meeting call line, enter your PIN. Use the question box on your right panel to submit questions and responses. To minimize the control panel, use the orange arrow at the top left panel. Following this webinar, please complete the evaluation. Judge McGinnis shared 4 handouts. You can find those on your control panel. A notification email will be sent out containing a recording of the session, slides, and the handouts. The recording, slides, and handouts will be posted on wellnesscourts.org. I will now turn the time over to our presenter, Judge McGinnis.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry there's no video. We were having some technical issues, so I cleaned up my office for no reason, but I'm happy to be here and to talk with you all. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat box as Janice instructed, and then Marlon will help me break in and answer any questions, because I do want to make sure people are understanding what I'm talking about. And sometimes I do get a little too nerdy about the brain. I have my brain model with me here, but I'm not going to be able to show it to you today. So you'll have to come see me in person someday whenever we can get back together. So my goal today is to give you information about how trauma changes the brain. And trauma, when I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about an experience that may have been traumatic in a person's life. Also talking about traumatic brain injury that could also cause changes to the brain, and substance use disorders, and also historical trauma. So I'll be talking about all those in detail about how they affect the brain. Not too much detail, so don't get too scared. And then I'm going to move into how we can mitigate trauma in our courthouses and in our facilities so that we can try to reduce triggers for folks coming into our services. So we want to strive to minimize potential triggers for people, lessen anxiety for people, so that they're not afraid to come back and see us. Because if people don't come back, if they've absconded, then we can't help them. If they don't go to their meetings, if they don't come to court, then we can't help them. So we need to create an environment that's as welcoming and safe as possible for folks coming into our services. And as Janice mentioned, there are 4 handouts that go into more detail about each of the things I'm going to be talking about. One in particular that I've read through, and it's very helpful, is essential components of trauma-informed judicial practice, that was put out by SAMHSA. And there's the other handouts, so I do encourage you to download those to get more information about the topics that I'm covering today. So why be a trauma responsive organization, and what does that mean? We've all heard a lot about being trauma responsive, trauma informed, healing focused, healing centered, and many courthouses are very focused on moving in that direction, and programs and healing to wellness courts. So before I go into the detail, I do want to just give, for those of you who haven't heard me talk before or don't know me, the reason that I am here and talking about the brain is before I became an attorney, I was a neuroscientist. So I have a PhD from the University of Michigan in neuropharmacology. And I've been using my knowledge of the brain and my training in neuroscience to talk to my staff and to talk to participants about what might be going on in their brain as far as neuroconnectivity and healing. And when you actually see, what's going on physically in a brain to change the architecture of the brain, it helps staff and it helps the participants be more understanding of what is going on for them and why it takes time to heal. So one of the things you'll be learning today, you'll be doing that first point of learning how to understand, recognize, and respond to trauma. So part of understanding trauma is understanding what's actually going on in the person's brain of folks who have experienced trauma. And then also learning to focus on the physical, psychological, and emotional safety of people in the courthouse, including staff and participants. And basically using, during the AIDS epidemic, we talked a lot about universal precautions. And now during the COVID epidemic, we're doing a lot of universal precautions around wearing masks and cleaning and assuming that other people might have COVID. So what we want to do is assume that everyone has a trauma history. And pretty much, of course, anyone coming into our healing to wellness courts is going to have a trauma history, because trauma and substance use disorders are so tied together. I think it would be highly unusual for anyone coming into any of our programs to not have a serious trauma history, whether it's childhood trauma, domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence, those kinds of trauma, or military. Of course, we're focusing today on military trauma. So it could be from being in a combat setting, having to respond to folks who are wounded in a combat setting, being a survivor of military sexual trauma. So those are all things that we need to keep in mind. I like to use a really pretty down-to-earth definition of trauma when I'm talking about trauma. There's all kinds of trauma. There's complex trauma and chronic trauma, but when I think of trauma, it's just any experience that overwhelms a person's ability to stay present. So we've all seen people check out. We've all seen people who, get a trigger and either they react really strongly, or they check out, or they're not present, or we can tell that they're not listening. They just get a, vague expression in their eyes because they're no longer really checked in with what's going on currently. So it's any experience that overwhelms a person's ability to stay present. And it could be a full-blown flashback that we see with combat veterans or other folks, survivors of sexual trauma, where they're having a full-blown flashback and aren't present at all, or just that they are completely checked out, or they're highly stressed or highly agitated without any obvious reason for them to be agitated. So that's what I think about when I think about trauma. Really, it's people who are acting without thinking. And I'm going to talk about how in the brain there's a disconnection between the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain, and the limbic system, the emotional part of the brain. So you'll see a lot of pictures of Kiki. Many of you have met Kiki, our service dog. She's our courthouse facility dog. So she's a service-trained dog. And if we had the video, I could have had her jump on my lap so you could see her. But we've been working with her for 2 years now. She's been in our courthouse, and she's trained through Assistance Dogs of the West in Santa Fe, which is close by where I am in northern New Mexico. And I use her when I have kiddos in the courtroom. And we also use her a lot with our Healing to Wellness court to work with the participants during court. So she'll go up to people and she senses people who are having stress. And there's been a lot of evidence that having a dog in the courthouse actually decreases stress for folks. So another kind of trauma is a traumatic brain injury, and we see that a lot in combat veterans, and it could be from a blast trauma. So not necessarily actually people getting their hit in the head, but just being around an explosion or loud noises can cause traumatic brain injury. And sometimes it's mild traumatic brain injury, and a lot of times there's not any diagnosis for that. So just like we would assume that people may have experienced trauma, we also might think when we interact with combat veterans and also with survivors of domestic violence, there's a lot of evidence showing that a lot of survivors do have traumatic brain injury from being struck in the head. So that might be something that's going on with folks who are in our courtrooms and aren't interacting, or interacting in ways that are surprising to us, that we don't expect them to interact. This was a study done, a paper put out in 2009 of a study of folks who were in Afghanistan and Iraq, showing the convergence of all these co-occurring disorders in military personnel. And I think this would be very similar in a survivor of domestic violence also, or a survivor of any kind of toxic trauma. You all had a great talk on Tuesday about co-occurring disorders, so I'm not going to go into it very deeply, but just be aware that with our military veterans and survivors of domestic violence and other survivors of trauma, there's going to be lots of co-occurring disorders, and these are going to converge. There's a lot of studies showing that traumatic brain injuries and major depression are highly correlated, and that also with our military veterans and survivors of any kind of domestic violence or child abuse, there might be chronic pain. And so the pain, of course, could lead people to using substances, and then it could be prescribed pain relievers at first, or they're just using substances to decrease their pain or decrease the symptoms of their post-traumatic stress disorder or their trauma, so that they can don't have to deal with the experience. So the substance abuse, major depression, chronic pain, TBI, they're all together. We have to assume that folks might be dealing with each of these. And that's why it's really important to use evidence-based assessments by licensed professionals to make sure that our participants are getting all of their needs met. And so when folks are coming into our programs, one of the things to understand is that there's a lot of overlap between traumatic brain injury, which is also sometimes called persistent post-concussive symptoms. So from the blast trauma of being in a military zone, or from being struck in the head, there could be a TBI, maybe diagnosed, maybe not diagnosed. But the symptoms overlap a lot with post-traumatic stress disorder. And the ones that crop up a lot in courtroom settings and in any kind of court-involved settings are going to be the hyperarousal, avoidance, people don't show up, people don't go to their meetings, anxiety of coming in, irritability, people get pissed off at the judge, people get pissed off at their probation officers in ways that seem outsized to us. So just be aware, especially with our veterans, that there's going to be a high incidence of potential overlap between the blast trauma or the other TBI and PTSD, and we need to take that into account as we're working with veterans in our Healing to Wellness Court. So I was talking about how people sometimes act in unexpected ways. So when people have to come to court, and this is Kiki, part of her, as I said, part of her job is to keep people calm. So this is her in a witness box demonstrating how people can touch her and try to stay calm and stay present during a hearing. And so when people first come to us, especially if they're coming out of jail or they were just arrested or they're coming in because social services has called them in on a child welfare case, so they're going to be scared. They might be withdrawing from their drug of choice. They might be having some trauma issues from being in jail. They're probably not having had a good sleep. So this is going to cause people to act in unexpected ways through having a trauma response. So their stress is going to be high. Their stress hormones are going to be elevated. And that's going to interfere with their ability to think, their ability of their prefrontal cortex to really be online. So the prefrontal cortex is the front part of the brain. And if you could see me now, you'd see me touching my forehead, because that's where the prefrontal cortex is. It's the outer part of your brain, just behind your forehead, and that's where people think. And that's the part of the brain that is not well developed in teenagers. So we know that teenagers are bad at making decisions. They don't do cost-benefit analysis very well. And unfortunately, you can't see me because the videos aren't working today, but I wish you could. And so, so what's happening in folks with trauma responses is that the prefrontal cortex goes offline because it's the neuroconnectivity is diminished. And I'll go into that in more detail with drawings in a moment. So when we're talking about trauma, it's important to understand that it's a natural response to unnatural circumstances. So our brain is always scanning our environments for danger. So just like if you're in the woods and you hear a sound and you don't know what it is, you're going to respond before you start thinking. And that's the brain in survival mode. We need to be able to react to a negative input, a potential danger, before we think about what that danger is. If we waited to think, then it would be too late. We might get eaten by the mountain lion. So, and folks with chronic trauma, they have hypervigilance because their stress hormones are always elevated, and that's causing an ongoing trauma, ongoing hypervigilance. And so they're really have a short fuse to going into a trauma response. And again, the trauma response might be causing people to act in unexpected ways because their brain is telling them that they're under threat, and that's because of their history. And so their neuroconnectivity has changed. Their trauma response is elevated already. They're already in trauma. If something negative happens, a judge looks at them sternly, their threat response may be what we see as being over the top. But for them, their brain is just reacting in survival mode. And a lot of it is for us, is to try to get them to heal through our program and create a space where they can heal. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some internal structures of the brain. I've talked already a lot about the prefrontal cortex, which is where there's planning, forethought, impulse control. It's goal-directed behavior, things that teenagers are terrible at, things that our clients are terrible at. You know, the folks coming in who are struggling with substance misuse, we know that they're not good planners. We can give them a calendar written out with everything they're supposed to do, and you know, they're probably going to lose it. Print them out another calendar so that, you know, they can have written down. So even if we're telling them, come to court tomorrow at 9:30, meet with your treatment provider at this time, go to these meetings, people aren't going to be able to remember all that. Of course, if you just tell them, even if they're saying, yes, judge, I'll do that. Yes, judge. They're not going to remember. We give them a calendar. They lose the calendar. We print out another calendar. You know, we don't sanction people for losing their calendars because especially at the beginning, people's brains are not working. They're not online. So their prefrontal cortex isn't highly functional. It takes a while for that to come back and to heal. The thalamus is a part of the brain in this area of the brain, and it acts as receives a sensory input and relays it to the amygdala and to the cortex. And I'm going to talk more about these in detail as far as the trauma response and what's going on with substance use disorders. The amygdala, many of you have heard of the amygdala. It's a part of the brain, and I like to say it's like a smoke alarm, because what it's doing, it's always scanning the environment for danger. It's also scanning the environment for positive things too, but we think of it more as scanning the environment for danger, like a smoke alarm. So it's going to get set off. And so folks who have a trauma history, their smoke alarm is hypersensitive. You know, it's that annoying smoke alarm in your kitchen that goes off whenever you cook bacon, you know, and then you have to stand underneath it, fanning it. So it's like a smoke alarm scanning for danger, and it's going to alert the rest of your body to have a response to danger if it sniffs out any sort of danger. So it's also where conditioned responses occur. So conditioned responses are something happens, either danger, either negative or positive, and your amygdala is going to mark that as an important thing. And it's going to remember, your brain is always taking in all kinds of information, sights, sounds, smells, touches. So it's going to remember what is happening when the negative or positive event happens. So for example, there was a series of experiments where mice were exposed to a pleasant cherry scent and then shocked at the same time. So then those mice, whenever they smelled the cherry scent, they had a trauma response, because even though the cherry scent didn't cause the trauma response, that association, that was the trigger for them having a trauma response, because then they always expected the shock to happen. So your amygdala is very key in trauma issues. And then the hippocampus is a part of the brain that stores long-term memories that are emotionally laden. So important events. Obviously, we can't remember everything that happens, because some people do that, but it's a very rare thing because there's just way too much information that happens. So we remember important events. Those of us who are old enough remember where we were when we heard about 9/11, things like that. So you can conjure up where you were, but you can't conjure up where you were the day before, probably, unless something particularly exciting happened. So your amygdala and your hippocampus work together to remember important events, emotion-laden events, or events such as what was going on when you found, when you found something really great, or when you had a trauma, like a sexual assault or something. The amygdala and the hippocampus are remembering everything that is going on, even if you're not aware consciously that you're taking all that in. But if you're, a victim of a sexual assault and the person was wearing a bandana, say, then your body might always tense up whenever you see a bandana, because even though you're not consciously making the connection to your sexual assault, your brain remembers that bandana. And I just want to emphasize about the prefrontal cortex being the brakes of the whole system, because that's just important to remember that without the prefrontal cortex being online, the limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus are going to be saying, go, go, go. And that's with using drugs or fighting a police officer or making whatever poor choice. Your limbic system isn't thinking about what's going on. Your amygdala isn't going to think about what's going to happen next. So, and we've all had the experience of our prefrontal cortex going offline, and that's called amygdala hijack. So, those of us who are judges or probation officers or working with clients, we've had the experience of feeling anger coming up in us so strongly because the person keeps interrupting us, or they're taunting us, or they're disregarding us, or they're talking to the victim when we're telling them not to talk to the victim, or whatever. But it's about losing our temper. So what happens is the prefrontal cortex stops functioning and the amygdala takes over. So our amygdala is really driving us, and it's about flipping our lids. And if you could see me, I actually have a little hand puppet of a brain, and it's your prefrontal cortex basically goes away, and you yell, you act in ways that are embarrassing. And we've all done this. I've done it with my teenager more times than I would care to admit, because the teenagers are really good at making us lose our tempers. So that's just so that we can sometimes relate to our clients not having good connectivity with prefrontal cortex, because as humans, we're all sometimes have a disconnection with our prefrontal cortex. Some of us are way better than others at being calm. And now that I'm in my 8th year of being a judge, I'm so much better at being calm than I was, or appearing calm anyways, even though if inside I'm boiling. Outside, I can still maintain a calm face because I've practiced a lot. And it takes a lot of practice and a lot of self-knowledge to know when you're feeling the start of you losing your temper, the start of your amygdala taking over your brain, to take a recess, to breathe, to get up and walk out of the office if you're with somebody who's making you angry, or to just say you need to reschedule, because and the way to get your prefrontal cortex back online is to just take a pause and breathe, and just feel yourself calm down and feel your heart rate go down. So we've all heard about the trauma responses of fight or flight. There's also freezing and surrendering. So what's going on when, say you're going hiking in northern New Mexico, like I like to do, where there are mountain lions, and you're walking along and you see a shadow. So you take that and you see a shadow, or you hear a thump beside you. That input is going to go to your thalamus, and your thalamus is going to send signals to your cortex, the thinking part of your brain. It's also going to send a signal to the amygdala. So the signal to the amygdala goes way faster than the signal to the cortex. So to the amygdala, it's like a superhighway, instantaneous signal of the visual or whatever the stimulus is. And then to the cortex, it's like a slow country road. And again, that's for survival. We need to be able to react super quickly if there is an actual danger. So imagine yourself walking on a trail, you hear a thump beside you or behind you, you're gonna react immediately. So your amygdala is getting the signal immediate. Then the amygdala is gonna send signals down into your body to react, to release hormones, to release cortisol, to get ready to fight. Your heart starts thumping harder, your breath starts going deeper. So you're ready to fight this mountain lion, you know, so you whirl around before you're even thinking, because you need to be able to think, you need to be able to act before you think. And that's a survival mechanism. So you're whirling around ready to fight, or you're diving off the trail, or you're hiding in the bushes. So you're fighting or you're fleeing, but then you whirl around and, you know, it's your dog. So for those of us without a chronic trauma history, our heart rate is going to go right back down. We're going to laugh. We're going to say, oh gosh, I can't believe you scared me so bad. And, you know, we're going to calm right down. For people who have a chronic trauma history, they're unable to bring their heart rate down as easily, or bring their breathing down as easily, because the connectivity here, if the mountain lion lives with you, if you go home every day and your abuser's there, or if you're in a combat situation where you're being in fear of assault and fear of bombs every day, so you're always under stress, the connectivity from the thalamus to the amygdala is strengthened. So there's increased neural connection. Most of you have heard the terminology, neurons that fire together, wire together. So the constant firing between the thalamus and the amygdala to signal danger gets strengthened in folks who are exposed chronically to stress, to danger, whether it's, you know, kids who have witnessed domestic violence or are victims of child abuse, survivors of domestic violence, survivors of sexual assault who are having trauma issues, combat veterans, people who are having lots of secondary trauma. The connectivity here is strengthened, and the connectivity to the cortex is actually weakened, so that the thinking part of the brain, that connectivity between the thalamus is actually weakened, because they're not, it's going to the strengthening of the amygdala and weakening of the cortex connections decrease the ability of the brain to act first, and then to think first rather, and then act later. And so people are more likely to act first and think later. And with the amygdala constantly being fired up by the thalamus connection, those downstream effects of the increased cortisol are chronic. And there's lots of health associations, negative health associations with increased cortisol. And that's part of what's going on with folks who have a lot of ACEs with their lower health and lower life expectancy and higher substance use disorder proclivity that was talked about on Tuesday, is that there's increased cortisol, increased stress hormone. So your body is always stressed.
Hi, Judge. This is Marlon from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. We do have a question while you're on this visual. And the question is, if a veteran was injured in the prefrontal cortex area, perhaps as a result of an explosion, will behavior modification work? In other words, if the brain center for inhibition is physically injured, will the brain be able to provide a substitute way to inhibit inappropriate behavior?
That's a great question. And, you know, I always think about with traumatic brain injury and changes from substance use disorder and trauma, kind of analogize it to somebody who's had a stroke. And that's really even with traumatic brain injury, because of the, you know, that there is actual physical damage to the brain. That brains are very malleable, and there's neuroplasticity. So there are different connections that can be made and trained. So of course it depends on how serious the damage is. And I'm not a medical doctor or a clinician. So, you know, this is really general stuff that I can tell you, is that there's always hope that people can be retrained and that parts of your brain will take over functioning. So there's always hope. And you never know when people are going to be able to heal and if people are not going to be able to heal based on the damage to the brain. But just like with stroke victims, the brain will try to find ways of functioning around the damage to the brain.
Thank you. There's no other questions at this time.
Thank you. So this is a slide from the Center on Developing Child at Harvard University. That's an awesome, if you just Google that Center on the Developing Child, it'll come up with this website with lots of great information. And this is just an illustration of about how toxic stress in children changes brain architecture. And that's gonna continue on to as an adult. So people's architecture that changes while they're developing as children can affect their adulthood. And there's lots of studies showing that victims of child abuse or children with or people with high ACE scores are going to have different neuroconnectivity because of the trauma they experienced as children, which is why trying to reduce childhood trauma is really like people should be running around with their hair on fire trying to figure out how to do that. And some people are, because it's it's so preventable of adult onset issues to try to prevent childhood trauma. And so the folks we're dealing with, of course, are going to be adults, but many of these adults do have children. And so this is just illustrating the changes in a neuron. This is the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus for a normal brain versus one that dealt with toxic stress. And just changes in connectivity and the number of branches that are coming out. So as I said, there's changes in the amygdala and the hippocampus. There's changes in connectivity to the prefrontal cortex due to toxic and chronic stress. Oops, somehow I got, okay, there I am. So I talked already a little bit about how substance misuse can change the brain, and I'm going to go into this more detail now with a little bit of explanation of how substance misuse occurs in the brain, how the brain is reacting to the substance misuse, and then some actual physical changes that we see in the brain. So the motivation pathway is also called the reward pathway, and that's what gets altered with substance misuse. So I really like to think about it as a motivation pathway, because when we get our participants in our wellness court, we're trying to change their motivation. We're trying to create a different motivation for them by using incentives to reward the behaviors that we want them to see more. We want to give them incentives for coming to court. We want to give them incentives for going to meetings and for working their programs. And that's really changing the motivation pathway. What substances do, so the motivation pathway, again, is just like a trauma response, is something that evolved and is necessary for survival. Because humans or animals, we need to drink when we're thirsty, we need to eat when we're hungry, we need to have sex to reproduce the species. So what happens when you drink nice water or drink any water when you're thirsty is you get a pleasure response. And we all have felt that, like how good that glass of cold water feels when after you've exercised or when you're thirsty for whatever reason. And so dopamine gets released. I'm sure you've all heard about the dopamine, and normally I go into way more detail about this, but that's a whole nother talk. So dopamine gets released from this area called the ventral tegmental area when we do something that is really good, like drink water or eat when we're hungry. And the dopamine gets released and it goes to the nucleus accumbens, and then there's downstream effects that create a pleasure sense, a sense of euphoria. So, and what happens is, of course, your amygdala is remembering all of this that's happening when you drink water. So when we used to live in the woods and we didn't have taps to go to for water, we would have to remember water sources. So humans would remember where they got the good water, and their amygdala and their hippocampus is remembering where that was so they could go back to that same spot to get the water. What happens with the substance of abuse is people take that and the release of dopamine is so much bigger than it is just with water or food or sex. So it's this huge euphoric release at the beginning of the substance misuse. So what's going on is your amygdala is saying, oh, just like your amygdala would say that I need that water to survive, and let's remember where we got that water, or remember where that game was so we can, or those roots were, so we can come back and get more of that to eat. Your amygdala is saying, wow, that felt so good. That must be so important. I need that substance to survive. So your hippocampus and your amygdala are working together to say, oh, that's something we need to survive. We need that drug. I'll die without that drug. Just like your brain says you'll die without water or you'll die without food. For people who become addicted to substances, their brain is saying, I'll die without that drug. That's what their brain is telling them. And so there's this huge conditioned response. So just like with the rat, or the mouse with the cherry smell and getting a trauma response. So the conditioned response here is you go to the corner store that you used to always go to where you used to buy the drug, and your brain, and even if you walk down the street, your brain is going to start saying, oh, this is where you got that drug that you need to survive. And so that's why we tell people, especially at the beginning, they need to change their people, places, and things, because the brain is going to connect those people, places, and things with the drug, and their brain is going to say, oh, here's your connect. Here's the place where you buy drugs. Remember, you need those drugs to survive. So the amygdala is going to start wagging and telling you that you need to find that drug to survive. And remember, this is the place where we got the drug, or this is the place where, or this is the person you bought the drug from, or even, there's that smell of alcohol. Let's go. Remember alcohol? Remember how much you need alcohol to survive? So that's what the brain is doing, and why it's such a strong drive is because it's really a survival drive. It feels like that within the brain of people who have these addiction issues, is that it's survival. So I know this is a rather complicated slide, but it's, and again, this is a whole nother talk, but I'm going to go through it briefly. So I talked about dopamine. So dopamine receptors in the brain are what, the dopamine binds to, and it creates that euphoric effect downstream. So scientists have measured the density of dopamine receptors in parts of the brain. So this part of the brain where it's yellow and red is called the striatum, and that's where the pleasure center is in that striatum. Now these slides are on the National Institute of Drug Abuse website, and again, that's a great website to go to, and they have all kinds of really good articles about substance use disorders and the effects on the brain. So again, so the red is going to be high density of these dopamine receptors, and the yellow is higher density, and then the blue is lower density. So a methamphetamine user, after 1 month of not using, you can see that their dopamine receptors are very low. So there's no red in these dopamine receptors. So there's been a change. So you know how when people use substances that they have to start using more substances to get the same effect. And eventually they're not really using the substances to get high anymore. They're only using it to feel okay. When people don't have their substances, they feel like crap. They feel sad, they're in pain, because their dopamine receptors have down-regulated, meaning there's not as many dopamine receptors, because the brain, when the brain is flooded with dopamine or with anything, the brain tries to react to it by going back to stasis, homeostasis. And so when there's too much dopamine happening, what happens is the receptors go away to try to protect the brain from too much dopamine. And you can see that down regulation here. Now, 14 months later, so this is 14 months of sobriety. So 13 months after this slide, or this picture, you can see an increase in the dopamine receptors again. So the brain is healing. This is showing healing brain. Now, I'm not saying that, 14 months is the magic time, because everybody is different. And everybody likes different drugs. The drugs all have different mechanisms of action to get to the point where the dopamine is released. So that's why different people like different drugs. Lots of people like any drug they can get their hands on, but some people really prefer meth or really prefer heroin or really prefer alcohol. That's because we're all different. We all have different genetic makeup that creates addictions. But this is just illustrative of that the brain does heal and it takes time. And this is another, over here on the glucose metabolism, is another illustration of the brain can heal, it takes time. So we all know that glucose is what the brain feeds on. It's what it uses for energy. And, you know, you think about, so many of us get hangry where we need to eat. If we don't eat, we feel like we're going to have an amygdala hijack because our prefrontal cortex is not working very well, and we get cranky with people because we're hangry. Now, I make sure that I always eat or am not feeling hangry before I go on the bench, because it's just not okay for judges to be reacting because we're hangry. And my staff knows I get hangry, so they sometimes tell me to eat a cheese stick or whatever. But I'm much better now in my older age to make sure that I'm that I don't eat very much sugar, and that my diet is good so that I'm not getting this hangriness. So this is a cocaine person who's using cocaine. Again, the top, so the control is somebody who doesn't use cocaine, does not have a substance use disorder. And again, the yellow and the red are showing higher density of glucose metabolism. That's glucose use of glucose. Now, this is somebody who's 10 days of sober on cocaine after using cocaine. So they haven't used cocaine in 10 days. And you can see that the glucose metabolism is down. Now, again, this isn't going to be like there's nothing happening in their brain, but it's just showing that their brain isn't as active or as firing as well as it could be. There isn't as much energy use as there could be, because the cocaine, the substance use disorder, is interrupting the use of the metabolism of the glucose. And then this is 100 days sober, so 100 days off of cocaine. And again, the glucose metabolism is not as high. And again, I don't want anybody to think this is, okay, 100 days is the magic time, but it's just showing that there is healing over time for folks who are recovering from substance use disorder. And for anyone in our programs, they're not really going to go their first 100 days without using their drug of choice, because if people could just stop using, then they wouldn't be in our wellness courts, because they wouldn't need to have that level of supervision. So when people come into our program, for me, wellness court for the first 90 days is really just trying to get people into the habit of coming to wellness court and start their brain healing. But in the meantime, they're going to be having slips along the way. It would be highly unusual for somebody to not be slipping along the way. And we don't freak out about slips. You know, we are trauma informed about it. Like, if somebody slips, that's not a reason for a sanction at all. We never sanction people just for slipping. They might be doing other activities or other actions around the slip that might be sanctionable for us because of choices they're making. But if somebody slips and comes in and says, "Judge, I slipped," or tells the probation officer they slipped, you know, that's not sanctionable. That's a treatment issue. So for the first 90 days in our program, I emphasize to my staff that people just really need to be worked with really gently. And the biggest key is to get people to come back and to keep showing up and get into the habit of coming to court and meeting with the probation officer and checking in. So we're very gentle in the first 90 days around sanctioning. And, you know, we may use some essays or things like that if talking to people doesn't work, but jail is never an option, at least for the first 90 days, unless there's something else going on, of course. And then this bottom one is atrophy. So these are both 43-year-old male. This person is a moderate drinker, so it's not somebody who doesn't drink at all, but they don't have a substance use disorder with alcohol. And then this is a severe alcoholic at 43 years. And so what's this illustrating is that the shrinkage of the brain And it's just showing the trauma, the brain damage to the brain due to alcohol, which is very poisonous to the brain. And then these dark spaces are just filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So this atrophy or the shrinking is due to the alcoholism. And we see that a lot in older alcoholics where there's dementia. And some of this might reverse if the person stops. And so the atrophy may get a little better and they may be able to function a little better, but you know, a lot of that damage is pretty permanent. And then the last type of trauma that I'm going to touch on scientifically is about historical trauma. Tribal communities and military families, you know, and Holocaust survivor families have known about historical trauma for forever. That trauma can be passed down through the generations. So there's the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Now the science is starting to catch up to it. So there's been a lot of recent scientific research around epigenetics. And so briefly, epigenetics is something that happens, epi is like on top of the gene. So it's outside of the DNA. So it's not mutations to the DNA itself. The DNA is the part of the genetic code that gets passed on through the generations. So you can examine two different people with the same DNA, but they may have different, they may look different and have different health outcomes because there are these other factors that happen. So DNA, and again, this is a very complicated topic that I'm going to try to just brush over. DNA is wrapped with histones, with chromatin, and wrapped around histones. And so the histones and the chromatin can be, the histones can be tagged with different factors. And so those factors, acetylation or methylation onto what packs the DNA, allows some genes to be accessible and other genes to not be accessible. So some genes will be expressed more in folks with trauma histories. So there's these methyl groups is associated with cortisol expression. So if there's lots of methyl, the cortisol is not expressed. So what's thought to happen is that parents with trauma history, their methyl groups are stripped from their cortisol because more cortisol is being expressed. And that stripping of the methyl group is passed on to their children and their children's children. So, for example, when I was talking about the mice with the cherry smell, the experiments that have been done is that, you know, the male mice is exposed to the cherry smell and the shock. That male mouse becomes afraid of the cherry smell. They take that mouse that's afraid of the cherry smell and breed it, and that mouse's children are afraid of the cherry smell, even though they've never been exposed to the shock along with the cherry smell. And that mouse's grandchildren also have a higher fear of the cherry smell, even though they've never been exposed and their parent was never exposed to the shock connected to the cherry smell. So that's just a scientific verification of what many communities have known for a long time about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. So I just want to touch on relapse. I talked a little bit about people slipping or having relapses. And the three main reasons that people relapse are because of the conditioned response that I talked about. You meet the people, places, things that remind your amygdala of that awesome thing that your brain needs to survive, that your body needs to survive, the awesome drug. And so your brain goes into survival mode to find the thing it needs to survive. Increased stress and trauma, because that's going to have the prefrontal cortex go offline. So the prefrontal cortex isn't going to be able to be doing the thinking about the consequences for the person if they do choose to go find their drug. And also a re-exposure to the substance. So obviously, we know that our folks cannot just go to the bar and have one drink. People try it all the time. Oh, I can just have one drink. But once they get exposed to that substance again, then, you know, they're down the road of relapse. And I know you all know this, but relapse is very common, and only half the people who get treatment for any addiction are able to stay sober completely after the first year. So most people are going to be having relapses, and most of the people and the veterans and the folks in our wellness courts who are coming in for substance use disorders and criminal activity or child welfare activity, they're in our program because they can't stop relapsing. So, you know, again, we're here trying to give them the support that allows them to keep coming back, to keep staying engaged in treatment, even though they relapse, that they come back and stay engaged in treatment. So I'm going to shift focus a little bit now and talk about creating the trauma-informed healing-focused courts. And this is also applicable to any facility or service provider that you happen to work for, but I'm focusing on courts because that's my expertise, and it's also the focus of this series of talks. So social isolation, I think, is key, and what I've found in my 5 years now as being presiding in a healing to wellness court is creating those social connections is key to helping people heal, and creating relationships is key to helping people heal. This is an experiment that was done in the 70s, and it's been repeated over and over again since then. So scientists took rats in these isolation cages over here, and they got them addicted to a substance like cocaine. So the rats would drink the cocaine water, they loved it, and they would choose the cocaine water over regular water in these social isolation cages. So once the rats were addicted to the cocaine and loving the cocaine, they took some of the rats and put them in this area they called Rat Park. So they built this really cool rat park. And so the rats could hang out with each other, they could run around, you know, they had their pails here. They could run through these cans and have fun and push things around and have sex with each other and go bowling, do things like that they enjoyed. So pro-social activities. And even though these rats were addicted to cocaine when they were put in this rat park and they were given the choice to drink cocaine water or drink regular water, these rats generally drank the regular water. They didn't care about the cocaine water anymore because they were having their fun and doing their thing with their peeps. So that's, you know, what I've been really trying to focus on in my court, is to creating more of the pro-social activities for our participants. Because I think, because once they're out of our court, you know, they need to create their own pro-social activities and continue their pro-social activities to continue their healing. And as I mentioned already, healing happens through connection and relationship. So these are, and I have permission from all of our folks to show pictures of them, but these are our folks doing, creating traditional pouches together. You know, they're hanging out, they're talking, they're laughing while they're working on their pouches. And the resilience comes from creating these stable, nurturing relationships. And you never know what that relationship is going to be. In our court, the strongest relationship that many people have is with our probation officer. And I was talking to somebody who's a clinical psychologist, and she talked about that a lot of that is to do with repair. So our probation officer is the one who's the sternest, you know, the most rule following, you know, the most holding people super accountable if they if their tests show positive for a drug. But so the probation officer can be stern and angry with somebody one day, but the next day, you know, she's like, hey, how's it going? You know, when the person comes back, it's a new day, new dawn, everything starts over. The person shows up and they get greeted, you know, pleasantly by a probation officer. So there's that repair that happens, because even though somebody may be sanctioned, but when they come back, you know, it's a new dawn, new day, the relationship is repaired. And many of our clients won't have experienced that repairing of relationships. And our team creates that familial relationships, you know, people's relationship with the judge, people's relationship with the probation officer, with the court navigator. is so key, and with their treatment providers is so key to helping people heal and learn to be in relationship without using substances, and also healing from their trauma of being in relationships that were a negative influence. And you never know who that one person is going to be, who's going to be that safe, stable, nurturing relationship that's going to be key for that person. You know, and I have a picture of Kiki here because some people have their first connection and relationship with Kiki, who come into our court. Like, they don't want to talk to anybody else, but they'll sit with the dog. And studies are showing that the dogs help decrease cortisol levels, increase oxytocin, so increase positive hormones, decrease heart rate, decrease breathing. So those connections are so key, and that's really what I'm trying to focus on in my wellness court, is creating these pro-social activities and these opportunities for people. I talked already about.
Judge.
Yes.
We have two questions.
Sure.
One, related to Kiki, how were you able to get Kiki introduced into your court? And then the second question is, with the social distancing measures and social isolation conditions being met, what is the effect of the social activities? If social activities are so important, what is the effect of our present social isolation conditions on participants?
Those are both great questions. So Kiki is through Assistance Dogs of the West, and there's a slide later on that has their website. So you'll be able to go to their website and see, and there's actually an application process. And, you know, we just, because we live in Santa Fe, we work really closely with them. I happen to be on their board now. So if anybody wants more information on that, I'm happy to, and I could send it out to TLPI, and they can send it out to everybody to get more information about how to connect. There's service dog organizations all over the country who do place in courthouses, and it would be awesome if more tribal courts were able to get service trained facility dogs. And we're really trying to work with more tribal courts to get facility dogs placed in courthouses, because it makes a huge difference. And I could, again, this is a whole nother talk, but it makes a huge difference with staff, and there's promising evidence showing that it decreases staff turnover to have a service dog placed in the facility, because it reduces staff secondary trauma, and it also helps with connections among the participants. And then the second question with COVID, that's such a great question. And, you know, we're doing what everybody else is doing around Zoom meetings and Zoom court hearings. And, you know, I think we're not going to know yet. And of course, we're having lots of folks relapsing, and we did not close our courthouse at all, except to not allow huge gatherings, or gatherings of more than 5 people. So we're still meeting one-on-one with participants and still doing drug and alcohol testing. We're slowly reopening now after June 1st, and we're going to continue the pro-social activities with smaller groups. So we're going to be alternating hiking with groups of 5 or less. So breaking it down into 2 or 3 different groups to go hiking, to do connectivity. We're actually breaking our wellness court up into 2 sessions so that we can have social distancing. We're lucky enough to have a big enough courtroom that we can have people 6 feet apart if we have 10 or fewer people in the courtroom. So I think there's going to be a lot of studies showing what the effect of this isolation has been on people for the past 2.5 months. I think it's going to be profound. It's going to be profound on people's mental health. And I'm actually terrified about when we actually start making more connections with people about what's been going on with domestic violence, what's been going on with child abuse, because we haven't had the reporting, of course, because people are isolated, unable to report, and the teachers aren't seeing the children. So I think right now it's a big question mark, and we are trying to reconnect and bring people out of isolation in safe ways, with masks required, etc. Lots of hand sanitizer. We have lots of alcohol-free hand sanitizer all over our courthouse, and so people don't have to worry about showing up positive for alcohol by using alcohol-based hand sanitizer. But again, a lot of it's an unknown, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more talks and seeing some research about what's going on with the isolation and the COVID. So I'm going to switch screens a little bit. So this is the Assistance Dogs of the West, assistancedogsofthewest.org. And I'm going to show a very short video about their Warrior Canine Connection program, which is amazing. And so it's just a short 2-minute video. I'm switching screens, so it'll be a little weird for a second. All right. So that's Assistance Dogs of the West, and that's their Warrior Canine Connection, and that's a program out of the Second Judicial Court in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And again, there's more information about that at the assistancedogsofthewest.org website, and I'm always happy to answer questions. And that was a beautiful video. And so that's a picture of Kiki with her Assistance Dogs of the West vest, because she is service trained, so she is a service dog and she's allowed to go in public places. So when we're thinking about environment in our courthouses or other facilities, we want to think about, look around and think about how to create an environment that promotes safety. This is Isleta Tribal Court. You know, I look at that picture and it's so calming to me. I'm so envious. It's a beautiful courtroom. And so you want to create a calming environment that, so people who are coming in who are already hyper aroused because their stress hormones are elevated or they're already nervous about what might happen, you want to create as calming an environment as possible. So part of it is thinking about what kind of art you have on the wall, whether you have traditional objects, the lighting, comfortable temperature, the noise is reduced as much as possible to promote safety. And some of the safety things can be having security in the courtroom if there's a domestic violence situation. I know many of us are very small courts. Pojoaque does not have a bailiff assigned to us permanently. We don't have metal detectors coming in, things like that. But if there is a need, if it's a domestic violence case, we ask a police officer to come in and be on board during that, or we'll ask the probation officer to come in just as an extra measure of safety. We were able to put in 2 separate waiting rooms, so the victim can be in one waiting room and the alleged perpetrator in another one so that they don't have to be in the same waiting room. And also not making people wait a long time before they come into their waiting room. And also making sure that people can find your courthouse, that it has good signage, because it's very stressful if you don't know where you're going. And so your stress hormones are going to be elevated, you're running late, the judge is going to get mad at you, you're afraid the bench warrant is going to go out. So make sure your courthouse is accessible, easy to find, and that there's nothing stressful that you can take out. One thing, we had a trauma assessment from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges a few years ago, and they gave us some simple steps of how to reduce trauma. One of them was put cushions on the benches out in the waiting room. Because of course we had never sat on the benches. We didn't know that they were terrible. So that was a really easy fix, and that helps people in the environment. Of course, we've taken them out now because of COVID, because we want to be able to clean the surfaces, but we will put them back once it's safe. Also making sure that we change our light bulbs, and that we just let people know what's going on, so that people aren't stressed because they don't know when their hearing's going to be or what's going to happen. One of the things we've really been working on, especially in our wellness court, is to reduce rules. So having a lot of rules is really stressful. And I don't have any rules in my courthouse. I mean, there's no written rules on the wall. You go into some courtrooms and there's just a whole laundry list of things you can't do. So I don't have anything, because people are adults, and if somebody's cell phone goes off, who cares? People do silence their phone in general now. People know how to do that, but every once in a while people screw up and they forget to turn off their cell phone, and really who cares? Is they're not going to answer it. If they answer it, then that's an issue, but they're going to turn it off right away. So when we are thinking about the rules that we might have, we ask ourselves, is this rule about safety or support of the participants and the staff, or is it about wanting to exert power and control over the participant? Because no hats is something that some judges no, you cannot wear a hat in my courtroom. And my feeling is, why? Some people having a hat on, and not, personally me also, I almost always wear a hat when I'm traveling, just because it makes me feel safer, it makes me feel more contained, like I'm not gonna be approached by people. It lets me hide, because I'm very introverted. So for some people, a hat is gonna reduce their trauma, and having a power struggle about whether they can or can't wear a hat is a huge issue. So that people drink and eat, like, who cares? They clean up after themselves, they're adults. I don't allow people to have side conversations, obviously, because that's not respectful to the people who are sharing. I don't care what people are wearing, as long as they're not wearing something with a substance like a marijuana leaf or a beer bottle. That's not allowed. But t-shirts and shorts, I'm not going to try to control what people wear. I'm happy that people show up, and it also allows people to show up and be comfortable. And that's really important for wellness court, which is a different kind of court, as you all know. And I also don't care if people swear. If they're telling me how their week went and they had a shitty week, I want them to be able to tell me they had a shitty week and use that language, because that's the language they're going to use. And we can have a better conversation about it, because they can talk about their asshole boss and not worry that they're saying something that it's going to offend me, because it's not going to offend me. And again, it's about respect and how the language is used. It's not about swearing at somebody. It's about just using language, in a normal way that people talk, so that they can be in court and be present and feel safe when they come in, and feel like they're welcome as they are. And it's really about meeting people where they're at.
Hi, Judge. We have
Yes.
a question. The question is, free parking in high population areas is not usually available. Does your court give any kind of parking voucher?
We have free parking, so the parking is not an issue. We're in a rural area. Land is plentiful and cheap, but I understand in a urban area that would be a huge issue, and I think that would be either. I think making sure that people can park, or have transportation, or have a bus voucher, or whatever they need, is key. It can be used as an incentive, or especially at the beginning, can be used just to make sure people are coming to court. I think that's a great idea, to make sure people have parking vouchers as part of an incentive program, or just part of the program to help people make sure they get to court. So these are the things that the Pueblo Pojoaque, we're always working on being a better court, and we always take suggestions, and we're making mistakes and we try to correct them, and we move along and try to figure out how to best be welcoming and trauma informed. So like I said, we did have a trauma assessment of the courthouse, and we also assess each participant for trauma by a licensed professional. This isn't just somebody filling out the ACE score, because just as I think Jill Campoli mentioned on Tuesday, if you just do an ACE assessment, that can be traumatizing in itself. So it has to be done in a context where the person is able to work with their clinician as they go through the trauma assessment. So it has to be done in a evidence-based, with a trained counselor. We've actually got all of our staff trauma certification. So we all did an online course and got certified as, I can't remember what the exact title is, but we all went through a course, we took tests, we got a certification for being trauma aware. Motivational interviewing is key for your staff, especially your navigator, your probation officers, your treatment providers, even the judge. And I have had motivational interviewing. I'm not very good at it. It's definitely not my skill set, but I have had the training and I'm aware of it, and I try to do it, but it's not really, I'm not awesome at it. We also use evidence-based groups like Seeking Safety or other trauma-focused groups. And we do gender-specific groups, which was mentioned on Tuesday. And our participants actually, I mean, again, we're not doing those now because of COVID, but as we get back into it, we are going to be doing it with the correct social distancing and masks. But we had gender-specific groups, and then our participants actually wanted to have one group a month as co-gendered. So they meet individually with the women and the men meet separately, and then they also have a group together about once a month. And then we also are implementing reflective supervision. One of the handouts is about reflective supervision. And again, this is a whole nother topic, but it's about taking everybody's trauma into account as staff and talking about our secondary trauma and understanding that we're human and that we'll make mistakes, and working through it and making an emotional connection with each other and being available with each other as a supervisor to supervisee. And it's a huge skill and takes a lot of skills building, but we're working on moving that way. And also trauma-informed supervision of people on probation, and again, using rules reduction to get there. And then, trauma-informed communication, one of your handouts goes into it deeply, so I don't really need to talk about it very much. But with our veterans, especially folks with TBI or other injuries, and this is and also for anybody really, just make sure as a judge or probation officer or treatment provider that you're not speaking really fast, that you're using common words, not legal jargon, and that you allow plenty of time for the participant to respond. So just because you ask a question, the person may be slower at processing what you're saying. So just wait, let them respond in their time. And that just because they have a slower response or they speak slowly, it doesn't mean that there's any lower intelligence. It's just a different way of processing. And it may be a way of processing that's happened because of a traumatic brain injury. So just remember to create pauses for people to speak. And it's hard, as a white lady from the Midwest, it's hard for me to not jump in and try to anticipate what people want to say. And it's really hard for me to just sit back and wait. And also just our facial expressions. Now, if you could see me, I would show you that my face normally falls in a kind of stern way. So I look really stern and maybe even angry to people when I'm usually not. But there's a way of just having a calm, open face. I heard somebody in a webinar recently say kind eyes. And it's really just like kind of raising your eyebrows a little bit and having a slight smile on your face. And you can fake it, even if you're feeling pissed off, you can still fake an open face. And even just doing the open face makes you feel calmer. So I use that a lot on the bench, and I practice that a lot. And I'm not going to go through this. This is what in one of your handouts. But it's just being really careful about what language we use when we're talking with participants. So, and it's really hard not to use the dirty and clean terminology, and my staff uses it still, even though we try to move away from it. So instead of saying somebody's dirty, that their drug screen is dirty, or that they're dirty, or that they're clean, you know, that the drug screen shows the presence of drugs, or the drug screen shows that the absence of drugs. So it's not about being clean or dirty. And I know this is really hard, and it's not, it takes a lot of practice to move into more trauma-informed language. And again, SAMHSA has a lot of information, and it's in that handout. And then with your advisory board, just get everybody together on moving towards being trauma-informed, so that everybody's on the same page, and have community meetings and get community input. And then the goal is the neuroplasticity. So this is the ability of the brain to heal. And we create these environments, and we create the opportunity for people's brains to heal, to create new connections, even though the old connections may be damaged or be different than without the substance use disorder, without the trauma, without the historical trauma, but create the resilience and the neuroplasticity to create the healing that is needed for people to keep moving forward. And that's all I have. And anyone can feel free to contact me. There's my email address.
Thank you so much, Judge. We do have a question. Let me go ahead and see if I can communicate the question clearly. So the participant cites a book by Dr. Charles Hodge, a nationally known expert on PTSD. And the book is called Once a Warrior, Always a Warrior. And in this book, he confirms that, quote, the fact what medical professional label symptoms are also combat survival skills, end quote. The author goes on to describe that, quote, PTSD is an emotional or psychological problem, but a physiological condition that includes physical, emotional, psychological, and behavioral reactions, end quote. And the question is, so where, in your opinion, do you think this type of interpretation fits into a military veteran's profile who have various co-occurring disorders such as PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, etc.? The question, or the person who asked the question, is interested in the post-traumatic spiritual dissonance approach when working with the veteran population.
Okay, well, I'm not a clinician, but I think that it being a physiological issue is pretty clear, you know, when I'm talking about how the brain architecture changes. So that's, you know, the physiological changes for folks who have PTSD and trauma. The science is now very clear that there are changes in connectivity between the different parts of the brain. I'm not familiar with the post-traumatic spiritual dissonance approach because I'm not a clinician. So this, you know, so what the purpose of this talk was try to explain that even though there's all these different diagnoses, PTSD, TBI, and other, you know, major depression, chronic pain, that they're all so interconnected, and there is a physiological connection. And emotions are physiological. Emotions are in your brain. They're from what's going on in your brain. And I know that's part of the spirituality too, but the brain is what's driving people's behaviors, and the way the brain is changed due to trauma or changed due to substance use disorder is what we're hoping to heal, or what in my program, we try to give the space for the brain to heal so that it's not reacting in ways that it was trained to react because of the trauma or because of the substance use disorder.
And we have one final question, which is a question about a statistics reference in PowerPoint slide number 20, which is entitled Relapse. And the statistic cited was 50% of people who get treatment for any addiction remain sober after a year. The question posed, the comment was, that seems a little high. Perhaps you could explain a little bit about the reference and maybe any other additional information about the statistic.
Well, yeah, sure, it seems high for folks in our programs. But this is of anybody, and this is including going to AA or NA on your own without being court involved. So this does not include court involved people. I'm sure the statistics for remaining sober after a year would be much lower when we're talking about folks who are in wellness courts. And so this is people with mild substance use disorders. And of course, we're seeing the people with severe substance use disorders. So that's, and I can find, I'm not exactly sure off the top of my head where I got this statistic, but I know it's from either SAMHSA or the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So, but that's anyone who's gotten any kind of treatment.
Thank you so much. At this time, we currently do not have any other additional questions in the chat or in the question box. So we want to go ahead from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, extend our appreciation to Judge McGinnis for this presentation. And just as a friendly reminder, all of the PowerPoints and handouts will be available on wellnesscourts.org, in addition to the video of today's recording. And again, that website is wellnesscourts.org. In addition to today's or this series